wind tore across the hills like a living thing, and Eleanor Hartley pressed her frozen hands against the heavy oak door, banging on it with all the strength she had left. Snow whipped around her ankles and climbed higher with every passing minute, soaking through her thin boots until she could no longer feel her toes. She had walked the last 2 miles from the train station on foot after the carriage she hired broke a wheel in a ditch, and now, standing before the servants' entrance of Ravenswood Hall, she prayed someone would hear her.
"Please,"
she called out, her voice cracking against the howling wind.
"I am the new governess."
"I was told to arrive this evening." Inside, a woman with sharp eyes and a face carved from years of hard discipline stood near the fire in the kitchen, arms folded, listening to the knocking with a deep frown. Agnes Whitmore had run this household for over a decade, and she trusted nothing that arrived unannounced in the middle of a snowstorm. The letter from the agency had said the governess would arrive the following morning. Not tonight. Not in weather that could freeze a person solid within the hour. "Who goes there at this hour?" Agnes muttered to herself, more irritated than concerned. She had seen too many tricksters and beggars try their luck at grand houses, especially during hard winters when desperation drove people to say anything, to get through a door and warm themselves by a fire meant for those who belonged there. The knocking continued, more frantic now. Agnes marched to the door, her keys jingling at her waist, and threw it open only a crack, letting a blast of icy air rush into the kitchen. She saw a young woman standing there, hair plastered to her face with melting snow, cheeks red and lips nearly blue with cold. The woman's clothes were worn, patched in places, nothing like what Agnes expected from a properly trained governess sent by a respectable London agency. "I am Eleanor Hartley," the young woman said quickly, teeth chattering. "The Duke engaged me through Mrs. Prescott's agency. I was meant to arrive tomorrow, but the earlier train was available, and I thought it best to come at once, before the weather worsened." Agnes studied her for a long moment, her expression hardening rather than softening. Something about the way the girl spoke, too polished, too eager, struck her as rehearsed. She had turned away impostors before, women claiming positions that were never theirs, hoping to slip into a wealthy household and disappear with silver spoons, or worse. And there was something else, something she could not name, a flicker in the girl's face that unsettled her in a way she did not wish to examine. "The new governess is expected tomorrow morning, in a proper carriage, with proper papers," Agnes said coldly. "I do not open this house to strangers who bang on doors after dark." "But I have my papers," Eleanor said, reaching with trembling fingers into her coat. "They are here, I promise you. If you would only let me show you inside where the wind is not." "You will show me nothing tonight," Agnes interrupted. "Go to the village inn. Return in the morning, when his lordship's steward is present, to verify your identity properly." "The village is 3 miles back the way I came," Eleanor said, panic rising in her voice. "I cannot walk that distance again, not in this storm. Please, I beg you, just let me stand inside the doorway until the snow lightens." But Agnes had already made her decision, the way she made all decisions in this house, swiftly and without room for argument. She did not trust easily, and something about this moment, something old and buried, made her chest tighten with an anger she could not explain even to herself. She stepped back and pushed the door shut, sliding the iron bolt across with a heavy clunk that echoed through the stone corridor. "Please," Eleanor's voice came muffled through the wood. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." Agnes stood with her back against the door for a moment, listening to the wind claim the voice outside, swallowing it whole until only the storm remained. She told herself the girl would find shelter somewhere, in a barn, under an outcropping of rock, anywhere that would keep her out of that door until sunrise. She told herself this was simply how a house like Ravenswood protected itself from strangers who came without warning. She walked back to the kitchen fire, rubbing her hands together, and tried to push the incident from her mind. But her hands would not stop trembling, and it was not from the cold. Outside, Eleanor sank against the stone wall, her strength finally giving out. She had traveled from London with nothing but a small case of belongings and a letter confirming her position, hoping this job would finally give her a stable life, after years of moving between temporary positions, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. She had grown up in an orphanage on the outskirts of Manchester, raised by kind but overworked matrons who had little time for the dozens of children under their care. She remembered almost nothing of her life before the orphanage, only fragments, a warm fire, a woman's voice singing softly, and the feeling of a small hand holding hers, a hand she believed belonged to a sister she had lost when they were both very young. The memories were faint, more feeling than fact, but they had shaped her entire life, a persistent ache for a family she could not fully remember and could never find. She had searched records when she was old enough, written letters to workhouses and parish offices, but the trail always went cold. Eventually she had accepted that whoever that sister was, wherever she had gone, they were separated forever by circumstances neither of them had chosen. Now, freezing against a stranger's wall in a storm that seemed determined to finish what fate had started long ago, Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself drift toward a dangerous stillness, the kind that comes when a body grows too tired and too cold to keep fighting. It was pure chance that brought Lord Rhys Ashcombe back to the house that late. He had been out inspecting a fence line damaged by the storm, riding hard through blinding snow because one of his tenant farmers had sent word that several sheep were trapped near a collapsed wall. He was tired, his coat soaked through, his horse exhausted beneath him, when he finally turned toward the stables behind the main house. It was his horse that noticed first, shying suddenly and refusing to continue toward the servants' entrance. Rhys frowned, peering through the swirling snow, and saw what looked like a heap of fabric against the wall, barely distinguishable from the drifts building around it. He dismounted quickly, his heart lurching with alarm, and crossed the distance in a few long strides. When he crouched down, he found a young woman, her face pale, her lips a worrying shade, her body frighteningly still, except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. "Can you hear me?" he said urgently, shaking her shoulder gently. "Wake up. You must wake up." Eleanor stirred weakly, her eyes fluttering open just enough to see a stranger's face close to hers, snow gathering in his dark hair, his expression tight with concern. "Please," she managed to whisper, "I only wanted to come inside." Rhys did not wait for further explanation. He lifted her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt, how thoroughly the cold had already taken hold of her, and carried her toward the door she had been locked outside of only minutes before. He kicked at the wood with his boot until it rattled on its hinges, shouting for someone to open it at once. Agnes, still standing near the kitchen fire, startled at the sound, her heart dropping the instant she recognized his lordship's voice, mixed with urgency she rarely heard from him. She hurried to the door and threw back the bolt, and what she saw stole the breath from her lungs. She was outside, Rhys said sharply, pushing past her with Eleanor cradled against his chest, freezing against the wall. "Fetch blankets, and hot water, now, before we lose her." "My lord, I did not know," Agnes stammered, following him as he carried Eleanor toward the sitting room nearest the kitchen fire. "She said she was the new governess, but she was not expected until morning, and I thought—" "You thought wrong," Rhys said, his voice cold with an anger Agnes had rarely seen from him. He laid Eleanor gently on the couch nearest the hearth and began rubbing warmth into her hands. "Whether she was expected tonight or tomorrow, you do not leave any soul outside in weather like this. Do you understand me?" Agnes said nothing, her throat tight, shame burning through her chest, as she hurried to fetch blankets and heat water for a bath that might save the young woman's life. As she moved through the corridors, her mind kept circling back to the face she had glimpsed in that brief moment, pale and half-frozen, yet strangely familiar in a way she could not place. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of exhaustion and firelight, and focused instead on the task at hand, gathering every blanket she could find, heating water until steam rose from the kettle, moving with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent her life managing crises in other people's homes, while burying her own feelings deep beneath duty and routine. By the time she returned to the sitting room, Rhys had already removed Eleanor's soaked outer garments and wrapped her in the blanket from his own shoulders, his expression tight with worry as he watched her breathing slowly steady. "Her color is returning," he said, more to himself than to Agnes. "Bring the water, quickly." Agnes knelt beside the couch and began the careful work of warming the young woman's hands and feet, following instructions Rhys gave in a clipped, urgent tone. As her fingers moved over Eleanor's cold skin, she noticed a small chain around her neck, a simple locket half hidden beneath the collar of her dress. Something about its shape sent an odd jolt through her chest, though she could not say why, and she pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the urgent task of bringing warmth back into a body that had come far too close to losing its fight against the cold. Slowly, gradually, Eleanor's breathing deepened, her color improved, and after what felt like an agonizing hour, her eyes opened fully, focusing first on the unfamiliar ceiling above her, then on the two faces watching her with such intense concern. "Where?" she began, her voice hoarse. "Where am I?" "You are inside Ravenswood Hall, safe and warm," Rhys said gently, relief evident in his voice. "You very nearly did not make it through that door." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Agnes, who knelt beside her holding a cloth soaked in warm water, her expression a strange mixture of guilt and something else, something unreadable. "You," Eleanor whispered, recognition flickering in her tired eyes. "You are the one who closed the door." Agnes lowered her gaze, unable to meet the accusation in those eyes, an accusation made all the sharper by the fact that it was entirely deserved. "I did not know," she said quietly. "I believed you to be someone else, someone dishonest. I am deeply sorry." Rhys watched the exchange, with a growing sense that there was more happening in that room than a simple misunderstanding between a housekeeper and a new employee, though he could not have said what instinct told him this. He simply knew, with the quiet certainty of a man used to reading people, that this night would not be easily forgotten by either woman, and that whatever had passed between them at that locked door would linger long after the storm outside had finally spent its fury. "Rest now," he said to Eleanor, rising to his feet. "We will speak of positions and papers tomorrow, when you have recovered properly. Tonight, you need only sleep." Eleanor nodded weakly, her eyelids already growing heavy again, though this time from exhaustion rather than danger. As she drifted toward sleep, her hand rose instinctively to the locket at her throat, closing around it the way she always did when she felt afraid, a habit formed in childhood that had never left her, though she had long since stopped remembering exactly why the small piece of metal felt like the only true connection she had left to a life before the orphanage, before the years of searching, before the endless string of houses that were never quite home. Agnes watched that small, unconscious gesture, and something inside her chest tightened painfully, a feeling she could not name and did not wish to explore, though it would return to her again and again in the days that followed, refusing to be silenced, no matter how firmly she tried to push it away. Morning arrived with a strange stillness, the kind that follows a violent storm when the world seems to be holding its breath. Snow covered every surface of Ravenswood Hall's grounds, transforming the gardens into smooth white hills, and burying the gravel paths beneath drifts taller than a grown man's knee. Inside, the household stirred slowly, servants moving with quiet caution as word spread through the kitchen about the near tragedy at the door the night before. Eleanor woke, in an unfamiliar bedroom, sunlight filtering weakly through heavy curtains, and for a moment she could not remember where she was or how she had come to be lying beneath such warm blankets in such a fine room. Then the memories returned in a rush, the storm, the locked door, the strong arms that had carried her inside, and she sat up quickly, wincing at the ache still lingering in her limbs. A soft knock sounded at the door before a young maid entered, carrying a tray with tea and warm bread. The maid, a cheerful girl named Clara, with bright eyes and quick movements, set the tray down and smiled warmly. "His lordship asked that you rest as long as you needed," Clara said. "But he also said you should eat something the moment you woke, to help your strength return." "Thank you," Eleanor said, gratefully accepting the tea. "I owe him my life, it seems." "You do indeed," Clara said, settling into a chair near the bed, as though eager for conversation. "The whole house is talking of nothing else this morning. Mrs. Whitmore has hardly said 2 words since it happened, which is unusual for her, as she generally has an opinion about everything." Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful at the mention of the housekeeper's name. "She seemed very certain I was lying about my position last night." "She has always been careful about strangers," Clara said, lowering her voice slightly. "More careful than most, if you ask me. Some say she lost people dear to her many years ago, before she came to work here, and it changed something in her permanently. She trusts almost no one completely, not even after years of service." Eleanor considered this information quietly, sipping her tea, and found herself curious, rather than resentful toward the housekeeper who had so nearly cost her life. There was something in Agnes Whitmore's face the night before, beneath the coldness and suspicion, that had struck Eleanor as familiar, though she could not explain why a stranger's features would stir any recognition in her at all. By midday, Eleanor felt strong enough to rise and dress properly, choosing her best gown from the small case of belongings that had somehow been retrieved and dried near the kitchen fire overnight. She made her way downstairs slowly, uncertain of the household's layout, until she found herself in a grand corridor, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, watching her progress with painted eyes. It was there that Lord Rhys Ashcombe found her, standing before a portrait of a woman in an old-fashioned gown, her expression curious rather than lost. "Miss Hartley," he said, and she turned quickly, startled by his sudden appearance. "I am glad to see you looking so much recovered." "My lord," she said, dropping into a proper curtsy, despite the awkwardness of the corridor. "I cannot thank you enough for what you did last night. I owe you a debt I do not know how to repay." "You owe me nothing," Rhys said firmly. "Any decent person would have done the same. I am simply grateful I returned when I did, rather than an hour later." He studied her for a moment, noting the careful way she held herself, the intelligence evident in her eyes, despite the exhaustion still visible in her posture. He had engaged her services through a respected agency, based on strong recommendations regarding her education, and her gentle manner with children. Qualities that mattered greatly, given his daughter's shy and grieving nature, since the loss of her mother 2 years prior. "My daughter Lily is eager to meet you," he said. "Though I must warn you, she is somewhat guarded with new faces. It has been difficult for her since her mother passed." "I understand grief affecting a young heart," Eleanor said softly. "I lost my own parents when I was very small, though I remember little of them now. I was raised in an orphanage, and I know something of what it means to feel the world has taken people from you before you were ready to lose them." Something in her words made Rhys pause, studying her with renewed interest. "An orphanage," he repeated. "That must have been a difficult upbringing." "It had its hardships," Eleanor admitted, "but the matrons did their best with limited means, and I was fortunate to receive an education that eventually led me to positions such as this one. I consider myself fortunate, all things considered." Rhys found himself admiring the quiet strength in her voice, the absence of self-pity, despite what must have been a genuinely difficult childhood. He led her toward the nursery wing, where his daughter waited with her nurse, and introduced the two with careful attention to Lily's hesitant nature. Lily was a small girl with dark curls and serious eyes, sitting primly on a window seat with a book held tightly against her chest, as though it might protect her from whatever new person had come to disrupt her carefully guarded routine. "Lily," Rhys said gently, "this is Miss Hartley, who will be helping with your lessons from now on." Lily studied Eleanor, with the frank assessment only children possess, taking in every detail, from her kind expression to the gentle way she lowered herself to sit at Lily's height, rather than towering over her. "Are you the lady who almost froze outside last night?" Lily asked bluntly, and Rhys winced slightly at his daughter's directness, though Eleanor only smiled. "I am indeed," Eleanor said. "It was quite an adventure, though not one I would recommend repeating." "Mrs. Whitmore locked you out," Lily continued, watching Eleanor's face carefully for her reaction. "Clara told the other maids, and they told me. Was it very frightening?" "It was frightening," Eleanor admitted honestly, seeing no reason to hide the truth from a child who clearly valued honesty over comfortable pretense. "But your father found me in time, and now I am here, safe and warm, and eager to begin our lessons together, if you will have me." Lily considered this for a long moment, her serious eyes studying Eleanor's face with unusual intensity, before finally nodding slowly. "I suppose we could try one lesson," she said, "to see if I like you." "That seems very fair," Eleanor said, hiding her amusement at the child's careful conditions. "Shall we begin with reading, since I see you already enjoy books?" Over the following hour, Eleanor discovered a bright, curious mind hiding beneath Lily's guarded exterior, a child who had learned to protect herself from further loss by keeping new people at a careful distance, but who clearly longed for connection, despite her caution. By the time the lesson ended, Lily had relaxed considerably, even laughing once at a small joke Eleanor made about a character in the story they read together. Rhys, observing from the doorway without either of them noticing, felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since his wife's passing, a small flicker of hope that perhaps his daughter might find her way back to happiness after all, guided by this remarkable young woman who had nearly lost her life at his own threshold only hours before. Meanwhile, in the kitchen below, Agnes moved through her duties with unusual distraction, her mind returning again and again to the image of Eleanor's pale face against the snow, and the strange, persistent feeling that she had seen those features somewhere before, long ago, in a place she had spent decades trying not to remember. She had grown up poor, one of several children in a family that struggled constantly against hunger and hardship, until circumstances she rarely allowed herself to think about had separated her from her younger sister, when Agnes herself was barely more than a child. She remembered carrying her sister on her hip when their mother grew too weak to manage, remembered singing softly to calm the baby's cries, remembered the terrible day when officials came and declared the family could no longer care for all its children, taking the youngest away to a workhouse while Agnes, old enough to be considered useful, was sent instead into domestic service. She had never learned what became of that sister, had spent years afterward too consumed with survival and grief to properly search, and eventually had convinced herself the girl had likely not survived the harsh conditions of workhouse life at all. It was easier, she had told herself over the decades, to believe her sister was gone entirely than to imagine her alive somewhere, growing up without any memory of the family that had loved her, before circumstances tore them apart. But now, watching Eleanor Hartley move through the halls of Ravenswood with a gentleness that reminded Agnes painfully of her own mother, she felt old wounds stirring in ways she had not experienced in years, and she did not know what to make of the persistent, unsettling sense that fate had brought this young woman to her doorstep for reasons far beyond simple employment. She busied herself with the day's tasks, instructing the kitchen staff on preparations for the evening meal, checking the household accounts with her usual precision, yet her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and more than once she found herself staring blankly at ledgers without truly seeing the numbers before her. Mrs. Whitmore, the cook, a stout and practical woman named Martha, said with concern, "You seem distracted today. Is something troubling you?" "I am simply tired," Agnes replied, straightening her shoulders and forcing her voice into its usual steady tone. "Last night's events left the entire household unsettled. It will pass." But it did not pass, not through the remainder of that day, and not through the following days, as Eleanor settled further into the household routine, growing closer to Lily with each passing lesson, earning quiet respect from the other servants for her kindness and diligence, and drawing the increasing, watchful attention of a housekeeper who found herself unable to look at the new governess without feeling the ghost of a memory she could neither fully recall nor entirely dismiss. A week passed, and the snow around Ravenswood Hall began to melt slowly under pale winter sunlight, revealing brown earth and stiff, frost-bitten grass beneath the retreating white. Eleanor settled into the rhythm of her new position with growing confidence, her mornings spent teaching Lily lessons in reading and arithmetic, her afternoons often filled with walks through the gardens whenever the weather permitted, and her evenings spent quietly in her room, writing letters to the few friends she had made during her years moving between positions. Lily's affection for her new governess grew with remarkable speed, surprising the household staff who had watched the girl reject companion after companion since her mother's passing. Where previous governesses had lasted weeks before Lily's guarded silence and quiet resistance drove them to resign in frustration, Eleanor seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of exactly how much space the child needed, when to draw closer, and when to allow her the comfort of solitude. "You have worked a small miracle," Reese told Eleanor one afternoon, finding her in the library, where she had been helping Lily select books for their next lesson. "I have not seen my daughter this content in longer than I can remember." "She is a remarkable child," Eleanor replied, watching Lily carefully examine the spines of several books with the same serious concentration she brought to everything. She simply needed someone willing to be patient with her grief, rather than expecting her to move past it on anyone's timeline but her own. Reese studied Eleanor for a moment longer than perhaps propriety allowed, struck again by the quiet wisdom in her words, the way she seemed to understand loss and healing, with a depth that suggested her own life had taught her these lessons, through hard experience, rather than simple theory. "You speak as though you understand grief intimately," he observed. "I suppose I do," Eleanor said, a shadow crossing her expression briefly, before she composed herself again. "Though my losses came differently than Lily's. I never truly knew my parents, only fragments of memory too faint to trust entirely. My greatest sorrow has always been the sister I lost." "You have mentioned her before," Reese said gently. "Would you tell me more?" if you are willing." Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward Lily to ensure the child remained absorbed in her book selection, before speaking quietly enough that only Reese could hear. "I remember very little, truthfully. I was quite young when we were separated, perhaps 4 or 5 years old. I remember a warm kitchen, and singing, and a hand that always held mine so tightly I never felt afraid. Then one day, everything changed, and I found myself in an orphanage, with no memory of how I arrived there, or what became of the family I once had." "Did you ever search for her?" Reese asked, genuinely curious, despite the private nature of the question. "I tried, when I grew old enough," Eleanor said. "I wrote to parish offices and workhouse registries throughout my early adulthood, but records from those years were often incomplete or destroyed entirely. Eventually I accepted that I might never learn what became of her, though I confess the wondering never fully leaves a person. Even now, I find myself searching faces in crowds sometimes, wondering if perhaps I might recognize her, though I know the likelihood grows smaller with each passing year." Reese felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for the young woman before him, admiring the resilience it must have taken to build a life of purpose and kindness despite such uncertain beginnings. "I hope someday you find the answers you seek," he said sincerely. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, offering a small, grateful smile, before turning her attention back to Lily, who had finally selected 3 books and was eager to begin the afternoon's lesson. Unknown to either of them, Agnes stood just beyond the library door, having come to deliver a message about the evening meal preparations, and had paused upon hearing fragments of their conversation drift through the partially open doorway. She had not meant to eavesdrop, had simply frozen in place upon hearing Eleanor describe memories that struck uncomfortably close to her own buried recollections. A warm kitchen, singing, a hand held tightly against fear. Her own hand rose unconsciously to her chest, where beneath her dress and apron, hidden from every eye in the household, hung a small locket she had worn every single day for over 20 years, since the terrible morning her family had been torn apart by circumstances beyond anyone's control. She had never removed it, never shown it to another living soul, keeping it as her only remaining connection to a sister she had long ago given up hope of ever finding again. She retreated quietly from the doorway, before either occupant of the library noticed her presence, her mind racing with questions she was almost too afraid to consider seriously. Surely it meant nothing, she told herself firmly, as she walked briskly back toward the kitchen. Countless children throughout the country had been separated from siblings during those hard years, sent to orphanages and workhouses, when families could no longer manage the burden of feeding every mouth. Eleanor's story, however similar in fragments, could belong to any number of women who had endured comparable childhoods. Yet the thought would not release its grip on her mind, returning again and again throughout the remainder of the day as she moved through her duties with growing distraction. That evening, after the household had settled and most of the staff had retired for the night, Agnes found herself alone in her small private room, sitting before a modest mirror with trembling hands, as she finally drew the locket from beneath her dress and opened it for the first time in longer than she could remember. Inside, a small faded portrait showed 2 young girls, one perhaps 8 or 9 years old, the other still an infant, cradled protectively in the older child's arms. Agnes remembered sitting for that portrait, remembered how her mother had scraped together every spare coin for months to afford the luxury, wanting some proof of her daughters together, before circumstances she could not yet foresee tore them permanently apart. She stared at the infant's face in the faded image, searching for any resemblance to the grown woman now living under this very roof. But the portrait was too small, too worn by decades of handling, to offer any certain confirmation either way. She closed the locket slowly, pressing it against her palm, and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to wonder seriously whether fate might have finally brought her lost sister back into her life, disguised in the unlikely form of a governess she had nearly left to freeze to death outside her own front door. The thought filled her with a complicated tangle of emotions she struggled to untangle, hope warring with guilt, longing warring with fear of disappointment should her suspicions prove entirely unfounded. She had spent so many years building walls around that particular grief, convincing herself acceptance was the only path toward any kind of peace, that the sudden possibility of reunion felt almost too dangerous to consider seriously. Yet she could not stop herself from considering it, turning the possibility over and over in her mind as she prepared for bed that night, staring at the ceiling long after she should have fallen asleep, her thoughts circling endlessly around a single, terrifying question. What if the young woman she had so nearly killed with her own suspicious caution was, in fact, the very sister she had spent 20 years believing lost forever? She resolved, before finally drifting into restless sleep, that she would find a way to learn the truth, however long it might take, however carefully she would need to proceed, to avoid raising false hopes, in either herself or Eleanor, before she possessed certainty enough to speak the possibility aloud. The following morning, she began, quietly and carefully, the work of piecing together a puzzle 2 decades in the making, though she could not have imagined then just how complicated and emotional that journey toward truth would ultimately become. Agnes began her quiet investigation, the only way she knew how, carefully and without drawing attention to herself, for she had learned long ago that a household staff noticed everything, and gossip traveled through servants' quarters faster than any letter could travel by post. She started by observing Eleanor more closely during the following days, watching for small habits or mannerisms that might confirm or dispel the suspicion growing steadily within her chest. She noticed the way Eleanor hummed softly while working, an old tune with no clear origin, that nonetheless struck something deep and familiar within Agnes each time she heard it drifting from the nursery. She noticed the small locket Eleanor wore beneath her collar, the same one she had glimpsed that first frightening night, and found herself desperate to examine it closely, though she could not think of a reasonable excuse to request such a personal request without revealing far more than she was prepared to share. Her opportunity arrived unexpectedly one afternoon when Eleanor brought a torn coat to the sewing room, asking if any of the staff might help repair a seam that had come loose during her long walk through the snow the week before. Agnes, who oversaw all mending duties within the household, offered to handle the repair herself, an offer that struck Eleanor as unusually generous given the housekeeper's typically brisk and businesslike manner toward her. "Thank you," Eleanor said, handing over the coat with genuine gratitude. "I would not wish to trouble you personally, given how busy you must be with the household accounts." "It is no trouble," Agnes replied, taking the coat with hands that trembled slightly, though she hoped Eleanor would not notice. "I find mending relaxing, truthfully. It allows my mind a rest from more complicated matters." Once alone in the sewing room, Agnes examined the coat carefully, her fingers running along the lining in search of the tear Eleanor had mentioned. As she worked the needle through the fabric, her fingers brushed against something firm hidden within the lining itself, something that had clearly been sewn there deliberately rather than simply caught by accident. Her heart began racing as she carefully worked the hidden object free, revealing a small folded paper alongside a second, smaller locket, this one plainer than the one Eleanor wore visibly around her neck, clearly kept hidden and protected within the coat's lining for safekeeping. Agnes unfolded the paper with trembling hands, finding it to be a faded certificate from an orphanage registry, listing Eleanor's name alongside a birth date and a notation that read simply, "Siblings separated, whereabouts unknown." Beneath that brief, heartbreaking notation was a single additional detail that made Agnes's breath catch entirely, a partial surname belonging to the family from which Eleanor had originally come, a surname Agnes recognized immediately as her own family name, from before circumstances had scattered every member across different paths, different lives, different corners of a country too vast and unforgiving to easily reunite lost relations. She sat frozen in the sewing room for several long minutes, staring at that faded certificate, her mind refusing to fully accept what her eyes plainly showed her. She opened the smaller hidden locket next, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it, and found inside a tiny curl of dark hair tied with a thin ribbon, exactly matching a similar keepsake Agnes herself had carried for over 20 years, tucked within her own locket alongside the faded portrait of 2 young sisters. The evidence, taken together, felt overwhelming, too significant to dismiss as mere coincidence any longer. Agnes carefully returned everything to its hidden place within the coat's lining, repaired the torn seam Eleanor had originally requested, and sat quietly afterward, trying to compose herself, before she would need to face Eleanor again, without revealing the enormous discovery she had just made. She did not yet know how to proceed. The weight of 20 years of grief, guilt, and buried hope pressed heavily against her chest, making it difficult to think clearly about next steps. Should she confront Eleanor immediately with what she had found, risking overwhelming the young woman with sudden, unverified claims of a connection that might prove painful if somehow mistaken? Or should she proceed more cautiously, gathering additional confirmation before risking the emotional upheaval that such a revelation would inevitably bring to both their lives? She decided, ultimately, on caution, though every instinct within her screamed to rush immediately to Eleanor's side and share what she had discovered. She told herself this decision came from wisdom and care, wanting to protect both herself and Eleanor from the pain of false hope should further investigation somehow disprove her growing certainty. But she also recognized, in the quiet honesty she allowed herself only in solitary moments, that fear played an equal part in her hesitation. Fear of finally facing the sister she had failed to protect all those years ago. Fear of the guilt and grief that reunion would inevitably force her to confront after decades of careful avoidance. That evening, she returned the coat to Eleanor, with the mended seam completed, unable to meet the young woman's eyes as she handed over the garment. "Thank you so much for your help," Eleanor said warmly, accepting the coat and slipping it on to test the repair. "You have quite a skilled hand with needlework." "It was nothing," Agnes said quietly, her voice tighter than she intended. "I am glad it serves you well again." As Eleanor turned to leave, Agnes found herself speaking, before she had fully decided to do so, the words escaping almost against her own will. "Miss Hartley," she said, "might I ask, do you know anything more of your family's original surname, before your time at the orphanage?" Eleanor paused, surprised by the sudden personal question, from a woman who had shown her mostly cold formality since her arrival. "I believe the records showed a partial surname," she said slowly, "though it was incomplete, damaged somehow, before it reached the orphanage files. I have never been entirely certain it was accurate." "What surname was recorded?" Agnes pressed, unable to stop herself despite every instinct urging caution. "Witt," Eleanor said, frowning slightly, as she tried to recall the exact detail. Only that much survived legibly, Witt, followed by letters too faded to read clearly. "Why do you ask?" Agnes felt the room tilt slightly around her. The confirmation she had both hoped for and dreaded arriving with such simple, devastating clarity. "No particular reason," she managed to say, her voice barely steady. "Simple curiosity, nothing more." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, sensing something significant beneath the housekeeper's carefully controlled expression, but she said nothing further, simply nodding politely before continuing on toward the nursery wing, where Lily waited for their evening reading together. Agnes remained standing in the corridor long after Eleanor had disappeared from view, her hand pressed against her chest, where the locket rested beneath her clothing, tears finally beginning to fall freely down her weathered cheeks, as 20 years of buried grief and hope collided within her all at once. She now possessed enough evidence to feel nearly certain of the truth, yet she found herself utterly unprepared for the enormous task that now lay before her. Finding the courage to speak that truth aloud, and facing whatever consequences, whatever emotions, whatever reckoning with her own past choices such a revelation would inevitably demand. For the remainder of that evening, Agnes moved through the household in a daze, barely registering the routine tasks she completed from long-practiced habit rather than conscious attention. Her mind remained fixed entirely on the growing certainty that Eleanor Hartley, the young governess she had so nearly turned away to freeze in a winter storm, was in fact the very sister she had lost and mourned for over 2 decades. A discovery that filled her simultaneously with overwhelming joy and crushing guilt over the terrible way their reunion had very nearly begun. In the days that followed her discovery, Agnes found herself trapped in a painful contradiction, her heart aching with hope and love toward the sister she believed she had finally found, while her behavior toward Eleanor grew increasingly cold and difficult to explain. She could not bring herself to speak the truth aloud, not yet, not until she felt entirely certain, and so instead of drawing closer to Eleanor as her heart desperately wished to do, she found herself retreating further into harsh formality, criticizing small errors in Eleanor's household conduct that she would normally have overlooked entirely, speaking to her with a clipped coldness that confused and hurt the young governess deeply. "I do not understand what I have done to displease her," Eleanor confided to Clara one afternoon, as the 2 young women folded linens together in the laundry room. "Mrs. Whitmore seems to grow colder toward me with each passing day, though I have tried everything I can think of to earn her approval. She has always been difficult to read, Clara offered sympathetically. Perhaps it is simply her nature, and has nothing at all to do with you personally. But Eleanor could not shake the feeling that something specific troubled the housekeeper, some particular grievance or suspicion that Agnes refused to voice directly, choosing instead to express her discontent through countless small criticisms and pointed comments that left Eleanor feeling perpetually on edge whenever the older woman was near. What Eleanor could not know was that Agnes's harshness stemmed not from any genuine displeasure with her conduct, but from an overwhelming inner turmoil that the housekeeper had no idea how to properly manage. Every time Agnes looked at Eleanor, she saw simultaneously the beloved infant sister she had once carried and sung to sleep, and the grown woman she had cruelly locked outside in a deadly storm through her own suspicious caution. The guilt of that near-fatal mistake haunted her constantly, manifesting as harsh words and unfair criticisms because she could not yet find the courage to address the actual source of her distress honestly. Agnes spent her private hours researching further, writing careful letters to parish offices and workhouse registries that might hold additional records, confirming the connection she now felt nearly certain existed. She traveled once to the nearest town on her single day of rest each month, visiting a registry office where old records from decades past were kept in dusty archives, searching desperately for documentation that might provide the final confirmation she required before she could bring herself to speak openly with Eleanor about what she suspected. The search proved frustrating. Records from that difficult period often incomplete or destroyed by fire, flood, or simple neglect over the intervening decades. Yet piece by piece, Agnes managed to assemble a fragmented but increasingly convincing picture, a family register showing two sisters born within a few years of each other, to parents who had later fallen into desperate poverty, a notation indicating the younger child had been sent to a workhouse when the family could no longer manage her care, and a subsequent transfer record showing the child eventually placed within an orphanage system that matched precisely the institution Eleanor had described as her own childhood home. Meanwhile, Reese began noticing the growing tension between his housekeeper and the governess who had brought such welcome improvement to his daughter's spirits. He found himself troubled by Agnes's uncharacteristic harshness toward Eleanor, behavior that seemed entirely inconsistent with the fair, if strict, management style she had displayed throughout her many years of service in his household. "Has something occurred between yourself and Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked Eleanor one evening, finding her looking unusually troubled after another difficult encounter with the housekeeper earlier that day. "I do not know what I have done to earn her displeasure," Eleanor admitted honestly. "I have tried my best to perform my duties well and cause no trouble within the household, yet she seems to find fault with nearly everything I do lately." "That does not sound like Mrs. Whitmore's usual manner," Reese said thoughtfully. "She has always been strict, certainly, but fair in her assessments. I will speak with her about this matter." "Please, my lord, I would not wish to cause further conflict," Eleanor said quickly. "Perhaps it will resolve itself in time, once she grows more accustomed to my presence in the household." Reese agreed, reluctantly, to allow the situation additional time before intervening directly, though he made a private note to observe the dynamic between the two women more closely in the coming days. He valued Agnes's decades of loyal service tremendously, yet he would not tolerate unfair treatment toward a member of his staff who had done nothing to deserve such harsh handling. As the days continued passing, Lily herself began noticing the tension within the household, her young but perceptive mind picking up on the strained interactions between Agnes and her beloved new governess. "Why does Mrs. Whitmore seem angry with you all the time?" Lily asked Eleanor bluntly during one of their afternoon lessons, setting aside her book to study Eleanor's face carefully. "I am not entirely certain," Eleanor admitted, deciding honesty served better than false reassurance, with a child who valued truth so highly. "Sometimes people carry difficulties within themselves that have nothing to do with those around them, yet those difficulties spill outward regardless, affecting how they treat others, even when it is not truly deserved." "Do you think she does not like you?" Lily pressed further. "I hope that is not the case," Eleanor said gently, "but even if it were true, I would try to remain kind toward her regardless, because kindness given freely, even when it is not immediately returned, has a way of eventually softening even the hardest hearts." Lily considered this thoughtfully, her young mind clearly working through the concept with characteristic seriousness. "I think you are very brave," she said finally, "to keep being kind to someone who is unkind back to you." Eleanor smiled softly at the child's observation, touched by her perceptiveness despite her young age. "Sometimes bravery looks like patience," she said. "And sometimes, the people who seem the most difficult are simply carrying burdens we cannot see. Burdens that make them behave in ways that do not reflect who they truly are underneath." Little did Eleanor know how precisely her words applied to her own situation, how the housekeeper's harsh treatment stemmed entirely from an overwhelming burden of guilt and hope that Agnes had not yet found the courage to share honestly. As Eleanor continued extending patience and kindness toward Agnes, despite the housekeeper's continued coldness, she unknowingly built the very foundation of understanding and forgiveness that would eventually prove essential when the truth of their connection finally came to light. That night, alone in her room once more, Agnes finally reached a difficult decision. She had gathered sufficient evidence now to feel nearly certain of the truth, and continuing to withhold this knowledge from Eleanor, continuing to treat her with unwarranted coldness born from her own unresolved guilt, served no one well, and only prolonged unnecessary pain for them both. She resolved to find the courage, however difficult it might prove, to finally speak the truth aloud, though she knew the conversation would require confronting not only Eleanor with this remarkable discovery, but also confronting her own long-buried guilt over the terrible mistake she had nearly made that first snowy evening, a mistake that had almost cost her the very sister fate had finally, miraculously, returned to her after 2 decades of believing such reunion impossible. Despite her resolution, Agnes found the following days slipping past without her finding sufficient courage to act upon her decision. Each time she resolved to seek out Eleanor and finally share what she had discovered, some fresh doubt or fear would surface, holding her back at the last moment. She worried that Eleanor might react with anger rather than joy upon learning the truth, given how harshly Agnes had treated her since her arrival, and given the terrible near tragedy that had marked their very first encounter. She worried, too, about disrupting the fragile peace that had settled over the household since Eleanor's arrival, the improvement in Lily's spirits, the smooth functioning of daily routines that Eleanor had helped establish within the nursery. A sudden revelation of this magnitude would inevitably upend that peaceful arrangement, at least temporarily, and Agnes found herself reluctant to introduce such upheaval, despite knowing the truth deserved to be spoken, regardless of convenient timing. Her continued hesitation, however, only deepened the harshness of her outward behavior toward Eleanor, as the internal conflict between her desire for reunion and her fear of the conversation required to achieve it manifested increasingly as short temper and unfair criticism. Matters came to a difficult head one afternoon, when Agnes, finding a minor error in the household linen inventory that Eleanor had helped organize as a favor during a particularly busy week, spoke to the young governess with a harshness that finally crossed beyond what anyone in the household could reasonably excuse as simple strictness. "This is entirely unacceptable," Agnes said sharply, her voice carrying through the corridor as several servants paused nearby to listen with concern. "I expected better organization than this. Perhaps governesses are not equipped to handle household management matters after all." Eleanor, who had genuinely tried her best with a task outside her usual responsibilities, felt tears sting her eyes at the unfair harshness of the criticism, particularly given how diligently she had worked to earn Agnes's approval since her arrival. "I apologize for any error," she said quietly, struggling to maintain her composure. "I will correct it immediately." "See that you do," Agnes replied coldly, before turning and walking briskly away, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the corridor, fighting back tears of frustration and hurt. Reese, who had witnessed the entire exchange from a nearby doorway, felt his patience finally reach its limit. He had observed the growing tension between the two women for weeks now, had noted Agnes's uncharacteristic harshness with increasing concern, and had hoped the situation might resolve itself naturally given sufficient time. But witnessing Eleanor's genuine distress at such unfair treatment convinced him that direct intervention had become necessary. He found Agnes shortly afterward in her private office, where she managed the household accounts, and closed the door firmly behind him before speaking. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone serious in a way that immediately caught her full attention. "I must speak with you regarding your treatment of Miss Hartley." Agnes felt her chest tighten with anxiety, sensing correctly that this conversation had been building for some time, and could no longer be avoided. "My lord," she began, "I assure you, any correction I offer serves only the household's proper functioning. I have watched your treatment of her for weeks now. Reese interrupted. "And I do not believe that explanation any longer. You have served this household faithfully and fairly for over a decade, Mrs. Whitmore, and I have never known you to treat any member of staff with the unwarranted harshness I have witnessed toward Miss Hartley since her arrival. Something else troubles you regarding her presence here, and I would know what it is." Agnes felt tears threatening at the directness of his question, the accumulated weight of weeks spent avoiding this very confrontation finally catching up with her all at once. She stood silently for a long moment, struggling against the instinct to deflect his question with some plausible but false explanation, before finally recognizing that continued avoidance served no purpose beyond prolonging her own suffering. "My lord," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to maintain composure, "I believe Miss Hartley may be my sister, lost to me for over 20 years, since our family was separated during a time of great hardship." Reese stared at her, utterly stunned by this unexpected revelation, taking several long moments to fully process what she had just confessed. "Your sister," he repeated slowly. "What evidence supports this belief?" Agnes explained everything then, the fragments of memory that had first stirred her suspicion, the locket discovered hidden within Eleanor's coat lining, the faded certificate bearing a partial surname matching her own family name, the additional records she had painstakingly gathered from parish and workhouse registries during her single days of rest throughout the preceding weeks. She spoke haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, as the long-suppressed emotions finally found release, tears streaming freely down her face by the time she finished her account. "Why have you not spoken to her directly?" Reese asked gently, his earlier anger softening considerably, as he began understanding the complicated emotional turmoil that had driven Agnes's uncharacteristic behavior. "I was afraid," Agnes admitted honestly. "Afraid she would hate me for how cruelly I treated her that first night. Afraid the evidence might somehow prove mistaken, despite how convincing it appears. Afraid of facing the guilt I have carried for 20 years, over failing to protect her when we were separated as children." Reese considered her words carefully, his own anger toward her harsh treatment of Eleanor now tempered significantly by compassion for the genuine anguish clearly underlying her behavior. "You cannot continue treating her unfairly while withholding such significant information," he said, though his tone had grown considerably gentler. "Whatever fear holds you back, you must find the courage to speak with her honestly. She deserves to know the truth, and frankly, so do you, rather than continuing to torment yourselves both with unnecessary distance and misunderstanding." "You are right," Agnes said quietly, wiping tears from her cheeks with trembling hands. "I have been cowardly, hiding behind harsh words rather than facing the truth directly. I will speak with her, my lord, though I confess, I do not know precisely how to begin such a difficult conversation." "Simply speak honestly," Reese advised. "As you have just spoken with me, she strikes me as a woman of considerable compassion and understanding, based on everything I have observed of her character since her arrival. I do not believe she will react with anger, whatever fears currently trouble you." Agnes nodded, drawing a steadying breath as she gathered her resolve. "I will seek her out this evening," she said, "once the household has settled for the night, and we can speak privately without interruption." Reese left her office feeling a complicated mixture of emotions himself, sympathy for the pain Agnes had clearly carried alone for so many years, cautious hope regarding the remarkable possibility that two women within his household might discover themselves reunited as long-lost family, and continued concern for how Eleanor might receive such an overwhelming revelation, given the difficult circumstances of their initial encounter. That evening, as the household grew quiet and most servants retired to their rooms, Agnes made her way toward the small chamber Eleanor occupied within the servants' wing, her heart pounding with a combination of hope and terror, unlike anything she had experienced in longer than she could remember, finally prepared to share the truth that had consumed her every waking thought for weeks, regardless of whatever consequences that honesty might bring. Eleanor sat alone in her small chamber, a single candle burning low upon the table beside her bed, when a soft knock sounded at her door. She rose to answer it, surprised to find Agnes standing in the corridor, her expression so uncharacteristically vulnerable that Eleanor immediately sensed something significant had prompted this late visit. "Mrs. Whitmore," Eleanor said, concern replacing her earlier hurt at the day's harsh criticism. "Is something the matter?" "May I come in?" Agnes asked, her voice unsteady. "There is something important I must discuss with you." something I should have shared weeks ago. Eleanor stepped aside, allowing the housekeeper entry, and gestured toward the single chair near the small table, while she herself sat upon the edge of her bed. Agnes remained standing for a moment, clearly gathering courage, before finally reaching beneath her collar and drawing out the locket she had worn hidden for over 2 decades. "I must show you something," Agnes said, her hands trembling as she opened the small clasp, revealing the faded portrait within, 2 young sisters, one holding the other protectively in her arms. "I have carried this locket since I was a child, since the day my family was separated by circumstances we could not control." Eleanor stared at the small portrait, her breath catching as recognition stirred somewhere deep within her, though she could not have said precisely why the faded image affected her so profoundly. "When you arrived that first night," Agnes continued, tears already beginning to fall, "something about your face struck me as familiar, though I dismissed the feeling as simple exhaustion and paranoia. But afterward, as the weeks passed, that feeling would not release its hold on me. When I mended your coat and discovered the locket and certificate hidden within its lining, I could no longer deny what my heart had been trying desperately to tell me." Eleanor's hand rose instinctively to her own locket, the one she had worn visibly since childhood, though she had never known its full significance beyond a vague, comforting connection to a past she could not fully remember. "What are you saying?" she whispered, though some part of her had already begun to understand. "I believe you are my sister," Agnes said, the words finally spoken aloud after weeks of internal struggle, tears streaming freely down her face now. "The baby I once carried and sang to sleep, before we were separated and sent to different institutions when our family could no longer manage caring for all of us." Eleanor sat frozen, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she was hearing, memories she had long dismissed as unreliable fragments suddenly rushing back with startling new clarity. A warm kitchen, a young girl's voice singing softly, a hand holding hers so tightly she never felt afraid, precisely as she had described to Reese weeks earlier, without ever imagining the owner of that hand might be sitting before her now. "Show me," Eleanor said quietly, reaching for her own small hidden locket that she had kept sewn within her coat lining for safekeeping. Retrieving it now, with hands that shook nearly as badly as Agnes's own, she opened it carefully, revealing the small curl of dark hair, tied with faded ribbon, that she had treasured, without ever fully understanding its origin or significance. Agnes gasped softly upon seeing the matching keepsake, reaching into her own locket to withdraw an identical curl, tied with ribbon from the very same original source, proof beyond any reasonable doubt that the 2 women sitting together in that small chamber shared blood and history far deeper than mere coincidence could explain. "It is true," Eleanor whispered, tears now falling freely down her own cheeks as the overwhelming reality settled fully into her understanding. "You are truly my sister." "I am," Agnes confirmed, her voice breaking entirely as decades of grief, guilt, and buried hope finally found release. "And I am so deeply sorry, Eleanor, for how our reunion began. If I had known, if I had allowed myself to truly look at you that first night, instead of assuming the worst, I never would have left you outside in that terrible storm. I very nearly lost you again, through my own foolish suspicion, before I ever had the chance to know you." Eleanor moved from the bed then, closing the distance between them, and embraced her sister for the first time in over 20 years, both women weeping openly, as decades of separation and loss finally gave way to the overwhelming joy of reunion. "You found me," Eleanor said softly, against her sister's shoulder. "After all these years of believing I would never know what became of my family, you found me. I nearly lost you before I ever properly found you," Agnes said, holding Eleanor tightly as though afraid releasing her might somehow undo this miraculous reunion. "I have carried such terrible guilt, both for our original separation and for that dreadful night when I turned you away at the door." "You could not have known," Eleanor said gently, pulling back slightly to look into her sister's tear-streaked face. "How could you possibly have recognized me, after so many years apart, arriving unexpectedly, during a violent storm? I do not blame you for your caution that night, not when I understand now how carefully you must guard this household against those who might seek to deceive or harm it. You are far more forgiving than I deserve," Agnes said, shaking her head slightly. "We have both suffered enough separately," Eleanor replied firmly. "I would rather spend whatever time remains to us, building the relationship we lost, rather than dwelling on circumstances neither of us could control, whether 20 years ago or a few short weeks past. The two sisters remained together long into the night, sharing fragments of memory and experience from the decades they had spent apart, piecing together the full story of their separation through combined recollection and the additional records Agnes had gathered during her careful investigation. They learned that their mother had passed away only a few years after the initial separation, unable to overcome the grief and hardship that had already broken her spirit, while their father had simply disappeared from all available records, his fate remaining forever unknown to either daughter. They learned, too, of the different paths their lives had taken afterward, Agnes eventually finding steady domestic service that led her, through years of dedicated work, to her current respected position managing Ravenswood Hall's household, while Eleanor had moved through orphanage life into a series of governess positions, never quite finding permanent belonging until circumstances beyond anyone's planning had finally brought her, quite literally, to her sister's very doorstep. "To think," Eleanor said softly, as the candle finally burned down toward its end, "that fate would bring us together again, in such an unlikely manner, through a position I nearly did not accept, arriving on a night when the storm very nearly cost us both the chance at this reunion entirely." "Perhaps it was always meant to happen this way," Agnes said, allowing herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to consider the possibility that some greater design had guided the seemingly random events that had finally reunited them after 2 decades of separation. However difficult and frightening our reunion's beginning, we have found each other now, and that is what truly matters. As dawn began breaking over Ravenswood Hall's snow-covered grounds, two sisters who had spent 20 years believing themselves permanently separated finally fell asleep beside each other, exhausted but overwhelmed with a joy neither had dared hope to experience again, their long-separated lives now irrevocably and beautifully reunited. News of the remarkable discovery spread quickly through Ravenswood Hall's staff the following morning, as Agnes and Eleanor emerged from their long night of shared revelation, looking exhausted yet radiant, with a happiness that immediately caught the attention of every servant they encountered. Clara noticed it first, observing the way the two women walked together toward the kitchen, with an easy closeness that had never existed between them previously, and could not resist asking Eleanor directly what had changed so dramatically overnight. "Mrs. Whitmore is my sister," Eleanor said simply, still marveling at how naturally those words now emerged from her lips, after a lifetime of uncertainty regarding her lost family. "We discovered the truth last night, after weeks of her carefully gathering evidence to confirm what her heart had apparently suspected since my very first night here." Clara's eyes widened with astonishment, and within hours, the remarkable story had traveled throughout the entire household, servants exchanging astonished whispers about the extraordinary coincidence that had brought two separated sisters together under the very same roof after 20 years apart. Martha the cook wept openly upon hearing the news, declaring it the most remarkable occurrence she had witnessed during her many years of service, while even the most reserved members of staff found themselves moved by the story's romantic improbability. Reese, informed of the confirmed reunion by Agnes herself early that morning, felt genuine joy on behalf of both women, recognizing immediately the profound significance this discovery held for two people who had each carried such deep, unspoken grief regarding their lost family connection. He made arrangements that same day to formally acknowledge the relationship within the household, ensuring that Eleanor and Agnes would face no awkwardness or uncertainty regarding how their newly revealed connection might affect their respective positions within Ravenswood Hall. "You need not worry that this discovery threatens either of your positions here," he told them both, having called them together to his study that afternoon. "Mrs. Whitmore, your decades of faithful service have earned you every measure of respect and security within this household, and that remains entirely unchanged. Miss Hartley, your excellent work with my daughter continues to be exactly what this family needs, regardless of whatever family connections you may have discovered." "Thank you, my lord," Agnes said gratefully, relief evident in her expression. "I confess I worried this revelation might complicate matters within the household considerably." "If anything," Reese said, smiling slightly, "I believe this remarkable reunion adds warmth to Ravenswood Hall rather than complication. Family, in whatever form it takes, strengthens rather than weakens a household, in my experience." "Lily," Upon learning the extraordinary news from her father that evening, reacted with characteristic directness and enthusiasm. "You have a sister," she said to Eleanor, her serious eyes wide with wonder. "Just like I always wished I had, before Mother passed. Does this mean you will both stay here forever now?" "I certainly hope to remain here for a good long while," Eleanor said warmly, touched by the child's genuine excitement, "especially now that I have found family so unexpectedly close by." "I am glad," Lily said simply, before adding with her usual blunt honesty, "I think Mrs. Whitmore seems much nicer today than she has seemed lately. Perhaps finding you has made her happier." Eleanor laughed softly at the child's perceptive observation, exchanging a warm glance with Agnes, who had joined them for this conversation, and could not help smiling at Lily's straightforward assessment of her improved demeanor. In the days that followed, the relationship between the two sisters deepened rapidly as they worked to reclaim the closeness that circumstances had denied them for 2 decades. Agnes began sharing stories of their shared early childhood that Eleanor could barely remember, filling in gaps in her fragmented memory with details about their parents, their modest but loving home before hardship struck, and the desperate circumstances that had ultimately led to their painful separation. "Our mother sang to us every evening," Agnes told Eleanor one afternoon as they walked together through the gardens during a rare break from their respective duties. "The same tune you have been humming, without realizing its origin, apparently carried within your memory, even though you could not consciously recall where it came from." "I have always found that melody comforting," Eleanor said, wonder evident in her voice, without ever understanding why. "To think it connects back to memories of our mother, memories I could not consciously access, but which remained with me regardless, is truly remarkable." Agnes also shared the difficult truth of their father's disappearance and their mother's eventual passing, information that brought fresh grief to Eleanor, even as it provided long-sought answers regarding the family history she had wondered about for her entire life. Yet even this painful knowledge brought a strange comfort, the relief of finally understanding, rather than continuing to wonder endlessly about circumstances she had never possessed sufficient information to properly grieve. "I am grateful, despite the sadness of learning our parents are both gone," Eleanor said one evening, as the sisters sat together, sharing tea in Agnes's private sitting room, a new tradition they had quickly established since their reunion. "At least now I understand my origins fully, rather than carrying only fragments and unanswered questions throughout my entire life. I wish I could have spared you those years of uncertainty," Agnes said, old guilt still occasionally surfacing, despite the joy of their reunion. "If I had searched harder, sooner, perhaps we might have found each other decades earlier, sparing us both such prolonged separation." "We cannot change the past," Eleanor said gently, reaching to take her sister's hand in her own. "We can only be grateful that circumstances, however unlikely, eventually brought us together again. 20 years is a long time to grieve a loss, certainly, but we have found each other now, and that reunion feels far more significant than dwelling on time we cannot reclaim." As winter gradually gave way to the first signs of approaching spring, the household at Ravenswood Hall settled into a new, warmer rhythm, shaped significantly by the remarkable reunion between its housekeeper and its governess. Agnes's previous harshness toward Eleanor had long since dissolved entirely, replaced by the protective warmth of an older sister, determined to make up for lost time through consistent kindness and support. Eleanor, in turn, found herself possessing something she had lacked her entire life, a genuine family connection that grounded her sense of belonging in ways her previous transient positions never had. The staff throughout Ravenswood Hall grew accustomed to the sight of the two sisters sharing quiet moments together whenever their respective duties allowed, Agnes teaching Eleanor additional details about their shared family history, Eleanor sharing her own experiences and perspective gained through her years within the orphanage system and subsequent governess positions. Their bond deepened with each passing week, built upon a foundation of shared history circumstances had once threatened to erase entirely, but which fate, through whatever unlikely combination of chance and design, had ultimately restored. Spring arrived properly at Ravenswood Hall within a few more weeks, transforming the grounds that had once been buried beneath deadly snow into a landscape bursting with new life, gardens blooming with early flowers, trees budding with fresh green leaves, and warm sunlight replacing the harsh winter chill that had nearly claimed Eleanor's life upon her arrival. The household itself seemed to reflect this seasonal transformation, the earlier tension and uncertainty giving way to a settled warmth that touched every corner of daily life at the great house. Rhys found himself increasingly drawn to Eleanor's company beyond the formal boundaries of her position as Lily's governess, seeking her opinion on matters ranging from his daughter's continued education to broader household decisions, valuing her thoughtful perspective and gentle wisdom in ways that gradually deepened into something beyond simple professional respect. Eleanor, for her part, found herself equally drawn to conversations with her employer, appreciating his genuine care for his daughter's well-being and the quiet strength of character he displayed in managing his estate's many responsibilities. Neither acknowledged openly the growing warmth developing between them, both maintaining careful propriety given their respective positions within the household hierarchy. Yet the household staff, ever observant of such matters, began noticing the lingering glances and easy laughter that increasingly characterized their interactions whenever duty brought them together. "I believe his lordship has developed quite a fondness for your sister," Clara observed to Agnes one afternoon, as they worked together preparing linens for the approaching spring cleaning season. "The way he seeks her company, even beyond matters concerning Miss Lily, suggests feelings extending well past simple professional regard." Agnes, who had noticed the same developing dynamic herself, smiled slightly at Clara's observation. "I have noticed as much myself," she admitted, "though I would not presume to comment on such matters directly, given how recently Eleanor and I have found each other after so many years apart. I would not wish to interfere in whatever happiness she might find here, whatever form that happiness ultimately takes." The growing bond between Rhys and Eleanor developed gradually and naturally over the following weeks, built upon countless small moments of shared understanding and mutual respect, rather than any single dramatic declaration. He found himself seeking her counsel, not merely regarding Lily's education, but increasingly regarding broader matters of the estate, valuing her practical wisdom and compassionate perspective on issues affecting the many tenants and workers who depended upon Ravenswood Hall for their livelihoods. Eleanor, in turn, discovered in Rhys a quiet strength and genuine kindness that reminded her, in some ways, of the family connection she had so recently rediscovered with her sister, a sense of belonging and security she had never previously experienced during her years of transient positions moving between various households throughout the country. Lily, observing the developing warmth between her father and her beloved governess with characteristic directness, eventually voiced what the entire household had already begun quietly suspecting. "I think father likes you very much," she told Eleanor one afternoon during their lesson, setting aside her needlework to study Eleanor's reaction carefully. "More than he liked my previous governesses, certainly. Do you think he might wish to marry you someday?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm considerably at the child's blunt question, uncertain how properly to respond to such a direct inquiry from her young charge. "That is not something either of us has discussed, Lily," she said carefully. "Your father and I share a professional relationship built upon mutual respect regarding your education and well-being. But you would not mind if he did wish to marry you," Lily pressed, her serious eyes studying Eleanor's expression with unusual perceptiveness for her young age. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, choosing her words with care, "that your father is a good and kind man, and I have come to value his friendship considerably during my time here. Whatever the future might hold, I am simply grateful for the happiness I have found at Ravenswood Hall, both with you and with my sister." Lily seemed satisfied with this careful answer, returning to her needlework with a small, knowing smile that suggested she had drawn her own conclusions, regardless of Eleanor's diplomatic response. The child's happiness at the prospect of her father finding companionship, and perhaps eventually a new mother figure who had already earned her genuine affection, remained evident in her improved spirits throughout the following weeks. As spring progressed further, Rhys finally found the courage to speak more directly with Eleanor regarding his growing feelings, choosing a quiet evening walk through the newly blooming gardens as the setting for this important conversation. "Miss Hartley," he began, somewhat formally despite the personal nature of what he intended to discuss, "I find myself needing to speak honestly regarding feelings that have developed considerably since your arrival here." Eleanor felt her heart quicken at his serious tone, sensing the significance of whatever he intended to share. "Please, speak freely, my lord," she said gently. "I have come to value your presence in this household far beyond your excellent work with Lily," he continued, his usual composed manner giving way to visible nervousness that Eleanor found rather endearing, given his typically confident bearing. "Your wisdom, your kindness, your remarkable resilience, despite the hardships you have faced throughout your life. All of these qualities have earned my deep admiration and, if I may speak honestly, considerably warmer feelings as well." Eleanor's breath caught at his sincere admission, her own feelings, which she had carefully guarded throughout the preceding weeks, given the complicated dynamics of their respective positions, finally finding voice as well. "I confess I have developed similar feelings," she said softly, "though I worried such admissions might complicate matters, given my position within your household." "Feelings such as these need not complicate anything," Rhys said, relief evident in his expression at her honest response. "If anything, I believe they might simplify matters considerably, allowing us to build something meaningful together, rather than continuing to guard against feelings we both apparently share." The conversation that followed, conducted amid the fragrant blooms of Ravenswood Hall's spring gardens, marked the beginning of an openly acknowledged courtship between Rhys and Eleanor, conducted with appropriate discretion, given societal expectations, yet openly celebrated within the household itself, by staff who had watched this connection develop naturally over the preceding weeks, with evident approval and genuine happiness for both parties. Agnes, upon learning of this development from Eleanor herself later that same evening, felt an overwhelming surge of joy on behalf of her sister, whose life had been marked by such prolonged uncertainty and searching, before finally finding both family and now, potentially, lasting love within the very household where their remarkable reunion had first occurred. "I am so happy for you," Agnes said, embracing her sister warmly. "After everything you have endured throughout your life, you deserve every measure of happiness that now seems to be finding its way toward you." "We have both found more happiness than either of us dared hope for, just a few short months ago," Eleanor replied, holding her sister close. "You found your lost sister returned to you, and I found not only a sister, but perhaps, in time, an entirely new family as well." By early summer, Ravenswood Hall had transformed completely from the cold, uncertain household it had been the previous winter, into a place filled with warmth, laughter, and genuine family connection that touched every person living within its walls. Rhys and Eleanor's courtship had progressed steadily through the intervening months, conducted with careful respect for propriety, yet openly celebrated by everyone who witnessed the genuine affection growing between them, culminating eventually in a proposal that Rhys delivered in the very gardens where he had first confessed his feelings months earlier. "Eleanor," he said, kneeling before her among the roses that had bloomed fully with the arrival of warmer weather, "you arrived at Ravenswood Hall during the harshest storm this estate has witnessed in years, nearly losing your life at my very doorstep. Yet from that difficult beginning, you have brought immeasurable warmth and joy to this household, to my daughter, and to my own heart. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, and making this house truly your home in every sense of the word?" Eleanor, overwhelmed with joy, accepted without hesitation, tears of happiness streaming down her face, as Rhys rose to embrace her properly, both of them laughing with the sheer relief and delight of finally acknowledging openly what had grown steadily between them since that fateful winter night. News of the engagement spread quickly throughout the household and surrounding estate, met with universal celebration from staff who had witnessed the entire remarkable journey, from that first dangerous night, through the discovery of Eleanor's connection to Agnes, and now toward this joyful culmination that promised to secure Eleanor's place within the family permanently, rather than merely as an employed governess whose position might someday end. Lily's reaction proved particularly touching, the young girl running immediately to embrace Eleanor upon learning the news, her earlier reserve and grief giving way completely to unrestrained joy at the prospect of finally having a mother figure again, one she had grown to love genuinely over the preceding months, rather than one imposed upon her by circumstance alone. "I knew it would happen," Lily declared proudly. "I told you father liked you very much, did I not?" "You did indeed," Eleanor laughed, embracing the child warmly. "You are remarkably perceptive for someone so young." Agnes, present for this joyful family moment, felt her own heart overflowing with happiness, witnessing her sister's remarkable transformation from an uncertain, searching young woman into someone now securely embraced by not one, but two forms of family. The sisterly bond they had rediscovered together, and now the marriage bond that would formally welcome Eleanor into the Ashcombe family permanently. "This calls for proper celebration," Reese declared, gathering the household staff together that same evening to share the joyful news officially, ensuring that everyone who had witnessed and supported this remarkable journey could properly celebrate its happy conclusion, alongside the family themselves. Martha the cook prepared a special feast for the occasion, while the entire household gathered in the great hall for an evening of celebration, unlike anything Ravenswood Hall had experienced since before Reese's first wife had passed. Agnes, given her position as both housekeeper and sister to the bride, found herself honored with a special place at the celebration, no longer merely staff overseeing the household's function, but genuine family celebrating alongside everyone else present. "To think," Agnes said during a quiet moment with Eleanor amid the celebration, "that this all began with such a terrible mistake on my part, nearly costing you your life through my own foolish suspicion. Yet somehow, from that darkest possible beginning, we have arrived at this joyful evening, celebrating not only our own reunion, but your marriage into this wonderful family as well." "Fate works in mysterious ways," Eleanor replied, smiling warmly at her sister. "I have come to believe that even our most difficult beginnings can lead toward the most beautiful outcomes, provided we remain open to the possibilities that unexpected circumstances might bring." The wedding itself took place several weeks later, a modest but joyful ceremony attended by the household staff, nearby tenants, and the few friends Eleanor had maintained throughout her years of transient positions, before finally finding permanent belonging at Ravenswood Hall. Agnes stood proudly beside her sister throughout the ceremony, serving in the role of closest family member that circumstances had once seemed destined to deny her entirely. Following the wedding, Eleanor's position within the household transformed completely, from employed governess to Lady of Ravenswood Hall, though she insisted on maintaining close involvement with Lily's continued education, unwilling to relinquish the meaningful bond she had built with the child during her months serving as governess. A new assistant was engaged to help manage the more formal educational curriculum, while Eleanor continued providing the emotional guidance and warmth that had first drawn Lily out of her prolonged grief following her mother's passing. Agnes, too, found her position within the household evolving naturally following these remarkable developments. While she continued serving as housekeeper, managing the practical daily operations that she had overseen so capably for over a decade, her relationship with the family had transformed entirely, from formal employer and employee dynamic into genuine familial warmth that touched every interaction between them. "You need not continue working so tirelessly," Reese told Agnes gently one afternoon, some months after the wedding, noticing his sister-in-law's continued dedication to her housekeeping duties despite her new family status. "You are family now, and family need not labor so extensively if they prefer otherwise. I appreciate your kindness," Agnes replied, smiling warmly, "but I find genuine satisfaction in my work managing this household. It has been my purpose and my pride for over a decade, and I would not wish to abandon it entirely, even given my changed circumstances. Perhaps I might simply enjoy it now with a lighter heart, knowing my sister and her family surround me with genuine love, rather than mere professional obligation." As the first anniversary of Eleanor's dramatic arrival at Ravenswood Hall approached, marked by the very storm that had so nearly claimed her life at Agnes's own hand, the household gathered to reflect on the remarkable journey that single dangerous night had ultimately set into motion. What began as a moment of terrible misunderstanding and near tragedy had transformed, through patience, honesty, and the persistent power of family bonds refusing to remain permanently severed, into a story of reunion, healing, and lasting love that would be remembered and shared throughout Ravenswood Hall for generations to come. Eleanor, now settled comfortably as lady of the estate, often walked past that same servant's entrance where she had once nearly frozen, no longer haunted by the memory of that terrible night, but instead grateful for the unlikely chain of events it had set into motion. Events that had ultimately restored her lost sister, brought her genuine love and family, and finally, after a lifetime of searching and uncertainty, given her the permanent sense of belonging she had longed for since childhood. The storm that had once nearly ended her life had, through fate's mysterious and often unpredictable design, ultimately led her home,